and Yan, and many thanks for setting up this seminar series. It's really been one of the very brightest spots in pandemic life. I can't express how much it's meant. Herodotus, and the delight of reading him in an undergraduate Greek course, is the main reason that I became an historian of ancient Greece. In spite of my early and abiding passion for the author, he managed to make it into my dissertation only twice. The reason for that was fairly straightforward. I was writing about the nexus of Greek demagogy words, demagogos, demagogein, demagogia, etc., and Herodotus never uses those words. Unsurprisingly, one of the bits of Herodotus that did make it into the project was the so-called constitutional debate at 380 to 82. While working on those sections, I noticed the use in several translations of the English word mob, a key word in the Anglophone reception of democracy that sometimes, but not always, betrays an underlying evaluation of democracy in the original Greek text. Those of you who were here for Ellen Millender's talk 3 weeks ago may recall that the translation she used of Herodotus 381 was one such text that deployed the word mob. Before returning to my thesis work, I made a note to myself to come back and examine the words for crowds in Herodotus to see whether their usage could tell us something about his attitudes towards democracy. I was delighted a year or two later when I got Tom and Liz's volume and discovered that no less a scholar than Peter Rhodes was interested in some of the same questions. It is indeed quite convenient that Tom and Yan included Peter's chapter in the emails leading up to his talk 2 weeks ago, as my talk today in many ways grows out of that chapter. I should also note that this research is in a relatively preliminary stage, so I may well leave you with more observations than conclusions and more questions than answers. Since it may have been at least a couple of weeks since folks have read Peter's chapter, I'll begin by summarizing the most relevant portions, which center on the words plethos, demos, and oklos. With respect to the first two terms, he summarizes nicely that, and I quote, demos, people, and plethos, mass, have overlapping ranges of meaning, but both can be used, and are used by Herodotus, of a large body of citizens with at any rate some political powers, and sometimes with an implied contrast between the ordinary citizens and the elite. Demos frequently refers to an entire community, and only in the case of Cleisthenes' taking the demos into his hetaireia does it clearly and specifically indicate the non-elite population of a community. Plethos is, of course, a different case, because it is both a more general word, it need not be political, and because in a political context, large but not complete numbers of citizens will by necessity contain at least a partial reference to the non-elites. That said, the fault line between the mass and few need not be drawn along the elite-non-elite line, and Peter explores the examples of both such cases in Herodotus. The third term that I mentioned, oklos, often used in a derogatory sense to describe non-elite populations, is never thus used by Herodotus. His one use of the word at all describes the Persians interrogating Croesus on the pyre about his calling out of Solon's name at 186. Peter concludes from his examination of these and other terms, rightly I think, that while Herodotus deploys, in a potentially anachronistic sense, language that was in common use during the second half of the 5th century to describe the democracy-oligarchy dichotomy, he does so in a way indicative of neither pro nor anti-democratic partisanship, and indeed, he devotes little time to distinguishing between democracy and oligarchy. Plethos and demos are not, of course, the only two words used to describe crowds of people in Herodotus, and since Peter's chapter is on Herodotus and democracy, it was an entirely reasonable decision on his part not to address all such terms. He does cover the other major terms germane to the discussion of democracy. There was one term, however, the omission of which I found slightly surprising, not because the term itself frequently appears in pro- or anti-democratic contexts, but because it has one particularly charged appearance in Herodotus. When Megabixus, at 381, bemoans that, quote, nothing is more foolish and violent than a useless mob, close quote, we might expect the mob there to be translating oklos. Or if we had read Peter's chapter and knew that oklos was not used in that way by Herodotus, we might suspect plethos or demos. In actuality, it is none of these. The useless mob is an akreos homelos. Homelos, as I hope I'll show today, is a particularly fascinating choice of word here, and betrays a deeper difference between Herodotus and authors to whom he is otherwise lexically similar. Indeed, this particular usage of homelos is unparalleled in Herodotus. Apart from at 381, homelos is nearly always a simple indicator of a mass of people without any obvious class undertones. In 5 of the 21 instances, homelos is combined with polos. In another 3, it is combined with other words for amount like suknos or pas. In fact, akreios is the only instance in the histories of an adjective other than polos, suknos, pas, alos, or loipos being applied to homelos. As was the case with Plathos, it is inevitable that multitudes of people, in an ancient Greek context, would conjure an expectation of the lower classes. But this aspect is never stressed outside of 381, and in many cases, context indicates that the multitude would have had to contain people from all levels of society. Like Gaul, the rest of my talk today will be divided into 3 parts. First, I'll go through the remaining words for crowds that I have identified in Herodotus, describing how they are used and what conclusions about Herodotus and democracy we can draw from that use. I will then take a brief detour into the question of 30,000 Athenians, 1 Spartan, deception, and decision-making, before concluding with an initial comparative consideration of the words for crowds in Herodotus and some of his contemporaries or near contemporaries. Besides Plathos, demos, oklos, and homelos, I looked at the nouns laos, stolos, thorubos, and homilia, and the adjective athroos, which appears more often in Herodotus in the Ionic form hales. As a disclaimer, I recognize that Herodotus sometimes uses polis, pleion, and pleistos to indicate groups of people. However, because the words have far broader usage and occur extremely frequently in Herodotus, a combined 898 occurrences, consideration of them was simply not within the scope of the current project. Not surprisingly, Herodotus's use of laos functions similarly to that described by Rhodes for his use of Plathos and demos. It's used to describe the suffering of the people of Egypt under Cheops, and their release by Mycerinus should likely refer more to the common people, as perhaps should its appearance at 122, when Alyattes expects the laos of the Milesians to be driven to desperation by his extended siege. This latter instance, though, could equally be interpreted as applying to the entire Milesian populace, elite and common alike. Mardonius's esteem for the Athenians as a numerous and valiant laos at 8-136 should almost certainly refer to the Athenians as a whole, and not the non-elites specifically. When Thales at 4-148 and Dorieus at 5-42 select a laos for colonizing missions, we can hardly imagine that the word was meant to suggest a lower class group. Indeed, the names listed as having joined Dorieus's venture clinch the matter. Stolos, almost always, 27 out of 35 occurrences, has a military connotation, such as expedition or force. Sometimes, that military sense can be expanded to include colonizing ventures, such as that of Dorieus in Book 5, or of Miltiades and the Athenians against the Dolonci at 636. Stolos can, however, also indicate something more like demos or laos in the sense of a group more generally, as it does at 1-165, when it describes the Phocaeans who have mobilized to leave their city behind, and at 1-170, when it describes the common group of Ionians to whom Bias of Priene offers the advice to found a single city. At 639, it indeed indicates a group that must be rather small, as it comprises only the ruling men of the Chersonese. The adjectives hales and athros seem to mainly indicate a group of things en masse, so to speak. They are mostly applied to people, but there are a few exceptions. Dessert courses for Scythian birthdays at 1-133, winged serpents at 3-109, bodies at 825. As with stolos, many uses are military in nature. These military uses sometimes denote coordinated tactics, Athenian assaults at 6-112 and 9-102, Spartan feigned flight at 7-11, Spartan superior fighting ability in a group as opposed to singly at 7-104. At other times, the military uses can indicate the unity of a force, the Egyptian navy at 313, the Persian navy at 7-236 and 823, the Greek army gathered on the isthmus at 915. Hales and Athros can also describe the density of a crowd, such as the 1,000 Egyptian club bearers in the festival at Pampremus, 263, or the tightly packed Greeks making their last stand at Thermopylae, 7-225. On several occasions, the adjectives have a pandemic sense. At 4-184, it describes the entire people of the Atarantes in opposition to the individuals. At 7-157, Greek envoys to Galon describe the importance of all Greece becoming hales, presumably a coherent whole people. Thorobos, as a word that indicates the confusion and noise of crowds, can be used to allude to the disorder expected of the demos or plethos by aristocratic-leaning thinkers. We see this kind of usage in Thucydides. Of his 15 uses of the word, 2 describe the shouting and hubbub of barbarians, women, and/or enslaved peoples during combat. 1 describes a mutiny by a plethos of sailors against an abusive leader. And 6 describe the panicked and disordered response of citizens to threats, often associated with words like ekplexis and phobane. So at Thucydides 892, we see confusion among the citizens in Athens and the Piraeus as the rule of the 400 unravels. Herodotus provides an important contrast with Thucydides here. Of the 9 instances of Thorobos in Herodotus's histories, 4 describe the naval battle at Salamis, 3 specifically with reference to the Persian navy. 1 describes the Peloponnesian generals at Salamis upon learning of the capture of Athens. 1, the valiant stand of the Aeginetan Pythias. 1, the killing of the Smyrtus the Magi, the false Magi. 1, the chasing of a hare by the Scythians. And only 1 could remotely be construed as pertaining to the disorder of a plethos or demos. At 9-5, the events around Lycidas's proposal to set Mardonius's offer before the demos, and his subsequent stoning, is described as a thorobos, from which the Athenian women learn of the event and kill Lycidas's family. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to an interpretation that would frame this passage as using thorobos to describe Athenian democratic decision-making. On the other, Herodotus's use of genitive absolute here makes it difficult to tell what exactly he intends us to understand thorobos to be referring to, and the Athenian plethos or demos is not really involved. Indeed, its involvement has been deliberately cut off by the presumably extra-legal actions of the council. The final remaining word, homilia, might be one that you put a mental question mark next to, and rightly so, given that its primary meaning indicates association or intercourse. Indeed, 4 of the 5 appearances of homilia in Herodotus carry these primary meanings, ranging from sexual intercourse at 1-182 to interethnic interactions at 477 and 4-174 to simple association between individuals at 716. However, in an ode to Herodotean ring composition, just as we began with an extraordinary meaning of homilos at 381, we return to an extraordinary meaning of homilia in the same chapter. After dismissing Otanes and the akreos homilos, Megabixus provides his own suggestion for Persian government, that they select a homilia of the Aristoi people. It's difficult to do a full analysis of homilia because the word is in fairly high use during the classical period, appearing nearly 200 times, many of which are the primary meanings, not the secondary meanings. But in the LSJ, every other provided instance of homilia to denote a group of people comes from the Attic tragedians. I suspect that Herodotus's primary interest in using homilia in this way, in this chapter, is to create the verbal parallel that I've noted above, but it is a usage and a parallel that could do with future further inspection. So, what to make of all this? In some ways, I think that it presents a counterweight to the thrust of Ellen Millender's points about Herodotus and democracy. Ellen is almost certainly right that the praise for the mechanisms of democracy in the speech of Otanes are not actively reinforced by the rest of the histories. However, what emerges from my work and Peter's work is that the more insidious claims of Megabixus about democracy, couched in language disparaging of the many, are also not repeated or reinforced by the histories. So, if Herodotus was not a partisan openly pushing the mechanical superiority of democracy, it seems that he did not share the contempt for the demos that was felt and openly expressed by many of his contemporaries. And indeed, the thrust of Ellen's talk was less that Herodotus thought democracy was bad than that he didn't think it avoided the dangers of self-interested decision-making present in every other form of government. How we interpret the lack of anti-democratic language in Herodotus will depend on several factors. In my work on demagogy words, I observed an unsurprising difference in the treatment of the demos between works with a broad public audience, for example, tragedy, comedy, oratory, and those with a more restricted audience, like history and philosophy. Thus, whether we believe that Herodotus gave his material as lectures, and how much we think he revised those lectures before the publication of the histories, may provide one possible motivating factor. The timing of composition and revision presents another considerandum, given that the rhetorical battle over democracy is escalated significantly from the middle to the end of the 5th century. If Liz Irwin is right that there was at least some degree of revision of the histories as we have them after the end of the Peloponnesian War, and potentially the publication of the work of Thucydides, the mildness of Herodotus towards the many will be all the more striking. As something of a final point on this matter and a segue to the next portion of my talk, I should note that I think it neither necessary nor desirable to assimilate Herodotus's treatment of democracy to his treatment of Athens. Despite his time spent in that polis, Herodotus was not Athenian, and if the Otanes' speech and Herodotus's vociferous defense of its 6th century Persian context tell us anything, it is that Herodotus did not view democracy as inherently Athenian. Continuing our Herodotean patterning, this leads me to a brief digression on Herodotus 597 and the famous observation that it seems that it is easier to deceive many than one. If the rallying cry of those who would frame Herodotus as a Democrat has often been his in propria persona assertion at 578 that the Athenians, after casting off their tyrants, proved that equality was a good thing in all respects, his comment about deception at 597 serves a similar function for those with the opposite viewpoint. But is Herodotus's comment about the liability of the many to deception supported by the rest of the histories? Peter's chapter on Herodotus and democracy starts us off by pointing out that Cleomedes does not come off particularly well in his own interaction with Aristagoras, and indeed that he is only saved from corruption by his young daughter Gorgo. I decided to go a step further and look at all of the episodes explicitly described as deception in Herodotus to see how often groups versus individuals were successfully deceived. I restricted myself to explicit instances, by which I mean those where Herodotus deploys words of deception to maintain objectivity. On the one hand, this approach probably meant that I did not examine a variety of passages that realistically present instances of deception. But on the other hand, since Aristagoras fails to deceive Cleomenes, not through some perspicacity on Cleomenes' part, but by telling the truth rather than trying to deceive him, it seemed best to leave the determinations about deception to Herodotus. I looked at 5 deception words: diabolo, diabole, apatao, ex-apatao, and apate. Between all 5 words, there were 51 appearances to consider. 24 instances of diabolo and diabole had to be dismissed, as they indicated slander, or sometimes literally carrying or crossing over, rather than deception. Similarly, 3 instances of apate were dismissed because they appeared as part of the formula for a proposed alliance, promising a lack of deception. Finally, I excluded 153, where Cyrus disparages the Greek agora as a place for people to deceive each other. Cyrus is pretty clearly thinking here of individuals deceiving each other, but this is a hypothetical or perhaps theoretical deception, not an instance of a person or group actually being deceived. For the 23 remaining appearances of deception words, I first consolidated instances of the same deception, thus Herodotus mentioning twice in 9:116 that Artaictes deceived Xerxes is only a single instance of an individual being deceived, not two, and the Persian elites, thinking that Cambyses meant to deceive them with his dying declaration and believing the false Smyrtus, a situation which draws 4 deception words between 366 and 79, counts as a single instance of a group being deceived. With that consolidation done, there were 12 instances of an individual being deceived to 6 instances of a group being deceived. If individuals are twice as likely to be successfully deceived as groups in the histories, we may, I think, reasonably wonder about the intention and impact of Herodotus's polus gar oike einai eupetesteron diabalein e hena. As a side note of potential interest, the only groups ever successfully deceived in the histories are the Athenians on 4 occasions and the Persians on 2 occasions. By contrast, individuals from a great variety of places and peoples are successfully deceived. Perhaps this phenomenon simply comes down to the centrality of the Athenians and Persians in the histories, or perhaps we are seeing another indication that Herodotus's aim may have been more at the Athenians specifically than at the Plathos generally. When doing lexicographical work like what I've presented here, I'm always acutely aware that usages and patterns are most meaningful when set in their proper context. The difficulty with providing context, of course, is that it multiplies the size of your undertaking by about 100-fold. However, I was nonetheless curious. How does Herodotus's use of words for crowds compare with other contemporary or nearly contemporary authors? So I did a bit of an experiment, and in the time that remains, I'll sketch out my methodology and show you what I found. To start, I needed raw data. So I went to the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae and conducted a simple text search of the full corpus for the lemmata of my crowd words. Since, for the time being, I was only interested in the number of times that an author used a particular word, I chose to have the TLG provide the results in chunks of 1,000 citations, rather than a smaller number of full passages. I then exported the results as a CSV file, a relatively simple data format that is easily ingested by Excel. As you can see in the screen capture here, most words had more than 1,000 results. Thorobos clocked in at over 5,000, and Plathos at well over 40,000. If I were being more scientific in my process, I would select a cutoff author and pull all of the data up to that author, whether that was 42 results or 15,150. In this case, I worked more roughly, pulling the first 1,000 results chronologically, unless more results were required to reach to about the 3rd century BCE. So, for example, I pulled 5,000 results for Plathos because it's so large. Once I had my raw citation data, I picked 18 relatively notable authors to make a more manageable data set. In addition to Herodotus, I selected Thucydides, Homer, Pindar, Bacchylides, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the so-called old oligarch, Plato, Aristotle, Aristophanes, Xenophon, Isocrates, Demosthenes, Aeschines, Lysias, and the Hippocratic corpus. I summed the uses of each crowd word by each author and retrieved the total words of their corpus from the TLG. Those numbers are in the top table of the 3 that you can see here. I recognize that these tables are large, and so the words and numbers are probably mostly unreadable on a PowerPoint presentation on Zoom. That's why, in addition to the handout, I asked Tom and Jan to share a link to the Google Sheet that has not only all of the raw citation data from TLG, but also these 3 tables. Nothing would delight me more than if anyone here or the students of anyone here would like to play with this data set, and I'd be happy to answer questions about it, provide whatever help I can, or collaborate on work related to it. It's fairly straightforward to copy a Google Sheet, so although the one that I've shared is restricted to view only to preserve the data from accidental damage, you're welcome to create a copy of the sheet that you can work with more fully, and I can provide instructions on how to do that. To return to the 3 tables, after I gathered the information in the top table, it seemed to me that 2 transformations from absolute usage numbers were desirable. From the first table, I took the number of appearances of a given word, divided it by the total number of words in the author's corpus, and multiplied the result by 1 million. That gave me a frequency of word appearance in a given author in words per million. I went with words per million to avoid the incredibly small fractions that would otherwise result. The second transformation was to assess the relative use of each particular crowd word out of the crowd word whole, so to speak. To create that third table, I took the number of each crowd word and divided it by the total number of crowd word appearances for an author. The resulting number is rendered as a percentage. So, to take an easy example, Bacchylides has 2 uses of homelos and 8 total uses of crowd words. So for Bacchylides, the relative usage percent of homelos is 25. I then took these 2 tables, words per million in corpus usage and relative crowd word usage, and visualized them as line graphs for easier comparison. Now, before I do some show and tell with the resulting graphs, a final brief disclaimer. By pre-selecting authors, I've already introduced bias into my results, and comparing charts by eye is not the most scientific way of determining similarity in a data set. If I wanted to make this project more robust, I would include all corpora from the TLG, and I would analyze the full data set using a platform designed for statistical analysis like R. By doing that, I could more accurately determine which corpora are most similar to that of Herodotus, and by tagging those corpora with chronological, generic, and geographical information, I could draw more nuanced conclusions about where Herodotus's usage fits from those standpoints as well. With all of that having been said, what I'll present now can serve as a sort of imprecise sketch from which we can draw some initial conclusions. This is more or less what the graphs will look like. On the x-axis, you will see the various crowd words, and on the y-axis, either the words per million, as here, or the relative percent. The points for the various authors are connected by colorful lines to improve readability. When I started by graphing the words per million in corpus usage table, I quickly realized that I had made a mistake. The enormous mountain that you see here is the old oligarch's usage of the word demos. In what will come as a surprise to absolutely no one who has read The Old Oligarch, he's absolutely obsessed with that word, and it destroys the scale of the graph. The second, smaller mountain under The Old Oligarch is, more interestingly, Aeschines' usage of demos. Although this result is less egregious than The Old Oligarch, it still distorts the scale enough to make interpretation difficult. As such, I decided to remove both The Old Oligarch and Aeschines from consideration. When we do that, the graph looks more like this. To try to avoid inserting further bias, rather than narrowing the graph by comparing Herodotus to historians or tragedians or the like, I simply looked at the chart, picked a feature on it, and went about removing outliers, always leaving Herodotus. For the first cut down, I focused on the middle mountain peak in the graph, which is at Deimos and Plathos. Removing outliers from this pattern removed Homer, Pindar, Bacchylides, Aeschylus, and Euripides. I then pulled out the corpora that did not peak at Plathos, which removed Sophocles, Aristophanes, Demosthenes, and Lysias. Finally, I pulled out Thucydides and Xenophon, whose peak at Deimos did not match the others, and the Hippocratic corpus, the peak of which at Hales Athroos was anomalous. It will probably not have come entirely as a surprise to you to see the poets disappear relatively early, but I think it is somewhat surprising that the usage of crowd words in Herodotus seems most similar not to the historians, Thucydides and Xenophon, but to the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and, if we can extend the title to him, Isocrates. What you might notice, though, is that Herodotus has a peak at homelos that very much does not match the usage of either the philosophers or the historians. They generally have higher uses of oklos and homilia than of homelos, while the case is reversed in Herodotus. So what are the comparable corpora for that mini peak at homelos in Herodotus? Well, let's bring back the full graph and then select for a peak at homelos. The answer is Homer, Bacchylides, and Pindar. The breakdown is not simply poetry versus prose, since the Athenian poets, both of comedy and tragedy, do not fit the pattern. Rather, it must be more specific, either by genre, non-dramatic, or perhaps geography, Attic versus non-Attic. Aeschylus fits the pattern better than the other dramatists, so that a chronological factor cannot be entirely ruled out. On the relative crowd word usage graph, matters are fairly similar. Here we have the initial graph with all the authors. Focusing on our Plathos peak removes the poets as well as Demosthenes and the Hippocratic corpus. There are then two possible groupings: Plato, Aristotle, Isocrates, and Thucydides, Xenophon, Lysias. As before, Herodotus seems to fit the Plato, Aristotle, Isocrates group slightly better. We also get the same results if we isolate for the Homelos peak, so I'll skip repeating that step. Besides using a sturdier methodology of statistical analysis, to draw really solid conclusions from this kind of comparative work, we would need to examine the individual usage of each term within each author, so that we could detect important differences, like that between Thucydides and Herodotus with respect to Thorobos. However, hopefully, work like what I've presented here today can point us in the right direction so that we know what 5 or 6 authors we should be looking at rather than having to consider dozens or hundreds. And it can raise some interesting questions, like what we can learn from Herodotus's use of homelos. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have.